Welcome to another episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, where we discuss ideas of democracy. Today, we are joined by Dr. Gwinyai Taruvinga, who is a researcher at the Global Change Institute and a lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand Political Science Department. Doc, welcome.
Thank you so much, Samukelo.
It's a pleasure having you here.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine.
Yeah, thank you. So to open up, I think we usually take the idea of democracy as kind of like a standard, that there's a consensus around it, that everyone knows what democracy is and what democratization is, therefore. So I want to start you maybe by, if you can just give us, how do you define democracy, hopefully from an African context, and obviously what systems do you think are vital for the democracy to thrive?
So look, democracy is very broad, and I think especially for the African context, one of the things we obviously look at is this idea of elections, term limits for presidential leaders, and I think that's a very crucial topic in African politics. And I think the most important and fundamental element of democracy for me is institutions. Because, one of the elements that you look at in any country, so, the governing aspects of any country, is this idea of independent and strong institutions. So in South Africa, we talk about the Chapter 9 institutions and how they sort of oversee elections. They oversee basically how the country functions. So I think one of the most important elements of any democracy are the types of institutions that are in a country. But from the African perspective, if you've, obviously looked at the history of the continent, democracy has often been, really a touchy topic. And this is mainly because I think several of the authors tend to think that democracy on the African continent seems to be more of an imposition from, the liberal democracy that we see in the West. And that, I think, is also one of the things that has contributed to this misunderstanding of democracy on the African continent.
Yeah. I like that you touch on institutions, and I'm going to come to that question just now, especially in thinking of colonial continuities and governance. But I want to hear your insights from the elections that we've just had over the past 5-10 years in the continent. I think you're looking at Kenya, for instance, which had its own elections not so long ago. And of course, the recent protest, a result of those democratic shifts. You've seen same thing in Zambia. You saw something where the recent elections, I know they will go to the elections next year, but the last elections have brought kind of like fundamental shift in terms of the politics here. And now we are seeing it in South Africa. You're seeing this power sharing thing. I think Kenya had a power sharing deal. The coalitions, I think here they call it the government of national unity. What are your key insights from these recent elections in these countries?
So I like your question, especially when you then touch on previous African countries and how they've conducted elections. So I'll just give you one example that comes to my mind now, which is that of Malawi. So the current president of Malawi, Lazarus Chakwera, when he became president, actually the Supreme Court actually overturned the result that had seen him being defeated initially, and then essentially then made him president afterwards. I can't remember if there was another election, but I do remember that the institutions in Malawi were very instrumental, especially the Supreme Court, and that then resulted in Lazarus Chakwera then becoming president. In Zambia was a very interesting case because under Edgar Lungu, when he was president, the campaigning was a bit difficult for opposition leaders, and the current president Hakainde Hichilema had such a difficult time campaigning to be president of Zambia, and he was arrested on several occasions. And this again brings to fore the particular points I think that you're trying to get to, which is this idea of democracy on the African continent. So in relation to elections, so I think you've mentioned the idea of coalition governments, And I think the idea of a coalition government, I think, is important for the African continent. So my first encounter with a coalition government, I wasn't born yet, but the first sort of government that came to my mind was in 1987 in Zimbabwe, where ZANU and ZAPU made a coalition government. And this was just after independence, and there'd been a little bit of instability in the country. And the idea then of a coalition government came from an author. I think his name was Andre Leipart. I think he's a Dutch scholar, and he came up with a theory called consociationalism. And basically, the idea of consociationalism sees, the elites. I use that term lightly. The elites, basically meaning those who control the country in terms of political support, coming together and then creating a government based on that. So the idea of consociationalism sees you sort of including everyone in the decision-making process so that you don't have conflict, because everyone has an equal chance of, having a taste of the pie, so to say.
Yeah.
So that's where then the idea of coalition governments then comes to the fore. So fast forward to Kenya in 2007, there was an election between, I think it was Raila Odinga and Mwai Kibaki. And basically the election was contested, and then it basically led to a period where there was political violence. And then Kofi Annan was able to negotiate a peace deal between the two parties and then create a government of national unity. So in that sense, the government of national unity, they sort of accommodated the two political parties that had received the most votes. And this is very important, I think, for the African continent because of the fact that we have so many competing interests. So when you then link that to the South African election that was just conducted a few months ago, you'll find that this current government also sort of speaks to that, whereby you find that the ANC obviously didn't get enough to create a government, but what they then did was sort of reach out to other political parties to then form what we now have as the government of national unity. And a lot of, the key thinkers, I know I've listened to a lot of, ministers who've served in governments of national unity. And one of the arguments that they make is that this is probably going to be the future for the continent because of so many competing interests that we have. And it's very important that you try by all means to accommodate everyone. And I think that is one of the most important elements we need to look at in terms of democracy, which is the inclusive nature of the system.
Yeah. The idea of the power sharing deals and the government of national unity or the coalition government as being the future of democracy in Africa is very interesting because, and I want you to talk to that also, but I also want to hear, because often these deals are presented as a kind of democracy at work. Mm-hmm. That this is democracy at its highest, where these opposing parties who are really all on the other spectrums of the politics are deciding that, we're going to come together and we're going to work together for the stability of the country. But does this really benefit? Does the people? Does it really go down and impact governance and impact the lives of the people? Could we really call it the future of democracy in the continent?
So I think the arguments that sort of look at it as being the future of democracy on the African continent, sort of the idea there is this idea I'm talking about, which is accommodating, competing ideas. So you find that in several African countries, elections tend to polarize the country. So I'll give you an example of the Zimbabwean election that was conducted in August of 2023. And I think President Emmerson Mnangagwa won that particular election. But one of the arguments that a lot of people are making is that the runner-up, Nelson Chamisa, I think had over 2 million votes. And you find that President Mnangagwa went ahead and he created his government because obviously he had the right to do so. He had the mandate. He had won the election. But Nelson Chamisa with 2 million votes, which is a significant amount of votes for any candidate to get, has sort of been excluded from that decision-making process. And as a result, the country is polarized. You see that, for example, with what happened with the just ended SADC summit, where, a lot of rumors were swimming that the government of Zimbabwe was arresting, political activists. Several things were happening behind the scenes. And this, I think, goes back to this idea that I'm talking about. You say, for example, and this is just an example, President Mnangagwa, for example, could have, included Nelson Chamisa to say, okay, look, you've had, this is the amount of votes I had, you have 2 million votes. There isn't really much of a difference in terms of our votes. It's just a slim margin. We should come together and let's find a way forward to, to move the country forward so that the country is not polarized. Because at the end of the day, citizens tend to, to follow politics religiously. And you find that those 2 million votes that the opposition received, they feel some type of way about how the country is being run. So the important thing of a government of national unity, at least in theory, is that it then is a vehicle to then include those 2 million people to say, okay, fine, you did not win the election, but, we can then include you to say, okay, look, this is the government we're creating. There's a role that you can play. And that ideally should then move the country forward.
Yeah. What is the impact then of this on opposition politics? Because the function of opposition in politics and in governance is to actually hold the ruling parties accountable and actually ensures that they offer an alternative. But what is the impact then if they know that, well, even if we lose, we can still negotiate our way in with the little that we have? So if we have 2 million votes, we can still go back to the ruling party and say, hey, we've got these 2 million votes, get us in. What's the impact then on opposition politics if coalition politics is the future of democracy?
So when you look at politics, one of the definitions of politics is who gets what, when, and how. So essentially it is the idea of saying that I have the power to do certain things. So in this case, how I think opposition parties should sort of look at it is to say a government of national unity, the whole idea of it is to prove your worth as an opposition party, to say, okay, look, we are the opposition party, but this is how we can do things, differently. I hate to use the idea of the current government in South Africa, where you see the DA saying, okay, no, look, we've cleared the backlog in home affairs, right? But some are saying, no, that's the previous minister. He's the one who started that.
Yeah.
But the point there is that the opposition can then show themselves whether, to say, look, we can actually deliver if we're given, even if you give us a small role to play, we'll play that role very well. And it will serve them well in the next election. Because then when they campaign, they can say, look, these are the results that we have from the role that we played previously, and give us the chance to then be the ruling party, and then we can implement more changes. But obviously, this is how it's supposed to work ideally.
That's a very interesting ideas that are emerging in how democracy is unfolding in the continent. But I want to roll back a little because unlike many other regions in the world, I think democracy arrives in Africa as we come to know it, at least, way differently. It comes in as an incentive. If you democratize, we will give you aid. If you democratize, we will extend your credit lines, and so on and on. These incentives being offered to these, and so in many ways, you're seeing the arrival of democracy as more celebratory, a formality that doesn't really impact the lives of the people, because these are pre-installed candidates who negotiate aid deals and credit line deals, and then they are palatable men to be elected, and so on and so on. But how much of this lends itself to the accusation that democracy is un-African, that it is external, and that it has Eurocentric origins or Western origins for that matter?
Okay, so this is a discussion that we've constantly had at university level in classes and so forth, and I think one of the things that we need to understand is that democracy works differently in many countries. And I think hence when we started, one of the things you asked is, how would I then define what democracy is? And I made the link to institutions. So within the African context, you find that when Kwame Nkrumah assumed the leadership of Ghana in 1957, he had a particular vision for the continent. So too, Julius Nyerere. And you'll find that because a lot of the countries at the time were fighting for independence, our nationalist movements, so ANC in South Africa, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, Chama Chama Pinduzi in Tanzania, were all fighting for independence. And you'll find that their ideological standpoint, right, was that of a socialist ideology, right? And for them, one of the things they then wanted to do was then build a post-colonial African state based on socialism. So this is based on, some of the work that they were writing during the fight for independence. But the biggest challenge, and I think that we've seen, obviously, I think a military coups, I think we'll touch on that at some point. But for the context of your question, one of the biggest challenges was that after the attainment of independence, unfortunately, our African leaders inherited what were already so-called liberal institutions. They inherited institutions that were based on liberalism, and more importantly, and this is something a lot of people tend to miss, they inherited extractive institutions. So if you go back to the history of colonialism, the whole idea of the system was the extractive of natural resources. So the Berlin Conference gives us a very good blueprint on the idea of what they were trying to do. So the European leaders. So when we then apply that to the African continent, of course, I think that was then the biggest challenge in post-colonial Africa, where they were trying to use systems that were already repressive. Firstly, they were trying to use systems that were based on marginalization. They were trying to use systems that were essentially exclusive, and they tried to make them inclusive. Hence, authors like Mamdani tend to then argue to say what you then have is a system whereby previously you had a small European elite who were sort of controlling everything, but now what you then have is a black political elite who are now controlling everything. So this challenge of democracy that we see on the African continent and this idea of it being Western is true to a certain extent. But if you delve deeper, you will see that the biggest challenge that this democracy faces is that it is sort of a continuation of colonial systems in terms of institutions, what we now then call colonial legacies. And because the democracy is working within the context of those colonial legacies, it has given us a difficult challenge in terms of implementing it fully. Yeah.
And then and again, I want to go back to your insights in terms of the new trends that we are seeing in elections, in voting patterns. Are we seeing shift in terms of and again, I'm talking about the recent elections that are we seeing shift in terms of more inclusive and ground up democracies that are shying away from this idea of democracy being external? Are we internalizing democracies now? Are we seeing ground up democracies? What are the voting patterns look like?
So I think if you look at the reports that have been sort of published by Afrobarometer, you will see that citizens have, genuine concerns, right? And what that then means is that what is important for our democracy at the moment is this idea of participatory democracy. And this is now democracy at a local level. So I think previously I mentioned to say that our nationalist parties and our nationalist leaders, one of the things they were trying to advocate for was a more socialist ideology. And if you delve deeper, I think there's a African ideology that we have. So I know a lot of work that has been done about how communities are coming together to improve their surroundings. I know in certain countries, for example, because a lot of our economies tend to be agrarian, a lot of the money that they make tends to come from agriculture, so they help each other cultivate their land. So for example, you can have an individual with a tractor. There's one tractor in the entire village, but everyone needs to plow their crops. What happens is that person will help everyone, and then the community basically comes together and they help a particular person. And to a certain extent, that is democracy at work at a lower level. And I think the challenge then goes back again to what we spoke about earlier, where I say that because a lot of what we're seeing currently is working within the context of colonial legacies, it is becoming difficult to implement. And you find that democracy at the lower level, so your villages and so forth, people tend to forget that. Yeah. And I think we need to look at that in terms of being inclusive, because at the end of the day, if you have top-down, democracy where decisions are made at the top, then passed to the bottom, it's really going to be difficult because it seems to be more of an imposition, and that takes us back to where we were under colonialism. The idea is to be inclusive, and you can only be inclusive if you start from the bottom. Talk to the communities, because in many cases they already have the solutions that they need, and then you can then build your country in that way. And I think, to me, of course, again, I wasn't there, but I think, to me, that was the idea of independence. That was the idea of having nationalist leaders, having this idea of saying that, look, let us go back to our communities and then build from there. Because if you actually also look at our history as well, the way that independence was gained by so many countries, it is because of the local population, right? They were the ones who were housing guerrilla fighters. They were the ones who were cooking for guerrilla fighters. They were the ones who were housing all these people who were trying to fight to gain independence. So that is very important in terms of the democracy we should be looking at on the African continent.
Speaking of independence, and I think the idea of independence and the post-colonial, and of course it is where we see more coups around independence, which is very much right at the same time as democracy. So democracy is happening at the same time with the coups. But of course, there was a time where we saw kind of like a decrease in these coups, but there's a re-emergence of these coups now. I think we saw a coup, not so coup in Zimbabwe not so long ago, a coup that was not a coup, that it was reported. We saw something also in Gambia. It's Gambia. We saw that. So there has been a real re-emergence of these. What is behind this re-emergence of coups in Africa?
So I think one of the things we need to look at in terms of military coups is how they obviously happen. So on one hand, you have the government. So that's the government that has been elected by the people. They have the mandate to deliver certain things. And then on the one hand, you have the people. So what happens in a social contract is essentially that a social contract is an unwritten, just a loose definition of it is an unwritten agreement between the citizens and the government. So the citizens vote for a government, and then the government essentially takes care of the needs of the citizens. So what normally happens is if there's a disjuncture between what the government is doing and what the citizens are receiving, it tends to leave a power vacuum. So, for example, you could have a president who stayed in power for too long. Thus, he's now, disengaged, is out of touch with reality, as people like to say. That creates a huge chasm between the two. And what then happens is that leaves room for a lot of things to happen. So protests could happen, uprisings could happen, etc., etc. So what then happens is that if, for example, a country has competing interests, right? So let's look at Francophone Africa, for example. We know that in Francophone Africa, France has a huge role to play. So in a country like Mali, France was instrumental in creating what they have as their army at the moment. So if they see that a particular president is not serving their interests, then that triggers something to happen. So a lot of the military coups that happen are often a failure in governance, or show a challenge in governance. They show a regression in democracy. So again, going back to the institutions, when a military coup happens, it often points to institutions that have failed to play their role. So the Zimbabwean example that you mentioned, there's a lot there in terms of term limits, to say that a leader stayed too long. firstly. Secondly, there's an idea of institutions, to say institutions were failing to keep certain people in check, and then the army then was given room to step in. In the example that you gave of the Gambia, something similar also happened, where again there's a disjuncture between what the government is doing and what the citizens expect of it, and because of that, it is given room for the military to then intervene, sometimes under the guise of saying, look, we can see that something is about to happen, so we're now intervening to sort of maybe tell the president to leave. But essentially, with a military coup, one of the things it shows is that it is a challenge for democracy. It is a challenge for institutions. And if you have weak institutions, and if you have democratic processes that are not functioning well, whereby, institutions are captured, essentially, it then leaves room for uprisings and military coups. And if you look at the history of military coups on the African continent, they often point to that. They point to to power plays between individuals. Think of our discussions on Thomas Sankara, competing interests there. Think again with the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. There were competing interests there. All these things become a challenge if you do not have strong institutions that are able to hold the country together.
I'm interested in the question of whether these coups are signifying an exit or an end of democracy, or a strengthening of democracy, because they usually come under the guise of democracy, that many of the promises of democracy are unfulfilled. Of course, the power vacuum and all of that, but there's usually the idea that things are not working as they supposed to work, and we will fix that. And so I think they enter on that. But I just want to hear your thoughts in terms of whether this reemergence of these coups an exit from democracy, where we're going to see, as some scholars call it, a new age of militarism and capitalism working together to kind of like repopulate the world, or these coups are actually strengthening democracy in the continent?
So for me, just I think to get the record straight, right? I am a believer in democracy, and in terms of it working in terms of its institutions, and institutions then overseeing how countries function. So constitutionalism, all those things are essentially important. So if you look at any constitution, it gives a role to the army. The role of the army is to protect the territorial integrity of a country. The role of the army is also to, basically defend the country, right? And that is the role of the army. The army, at least in my opinion, should not be intervening in civilian issues. When I say civilian issues, they should not be intervening in terms of, elections. They should not be intervening in terms of, trying to install a particular leader. That is not the role of the army. The role of the army is just to essentially take care of the country's territorial integrity, right? So because now we're seeing that the army is sort of abdicating that role and getting into politics, it is a huge challenge for us, right? And it doesn't paint a positive picture for us going forward, because we need democracy to work, and it can only work if it's allowed to do so. You can't come in and then say, look, it's not working because you don't like a particular leader. That is not how the system works. That's not how the system is supposed to work. The system is supposed to work in the sense that your institution should oversee everything. To say, okay, fine, we don't like X leader. What we're going to do is we're going to wait for the next electoral cycle, then we're going to vote, and then there'll be a new government. That is what democracy is supposed to do. But now when you have your army leaving the barracks to go and, try to, change things, that is not how it's supposed to work. So for me, that is really a worrying trend that we're seeing, because some people might be in favor of that, but no, you need your institutions to function. Your institutions should be independent. And once you have that, you won't have that scenario where your army is now trying to get into civilian issues.
Speaking of territorial integrity and of course, the integrity of borders and all these things, I want to pose a question here on what I think has become a very central theme in elections, not just in Africa, but across the world, of migrants, immigration and stuff. And I know that in Africa, the nation state arrives way differently than Europe and all these other places. Because here you basically, within a stroke of a pen, had a border where it was just one family, so that in the end you have a family separated by a border where the one is on the other side, one is on the other side, you know. And of course the post-colonial doesn't fix that. We have those borders now, and the contestations right now are on what people are calling immigrants when people are moving in between these two. I want to hear your thought on how democracy can enter that conversation, because we haven't figured out democracy for the outsider. Democracy is always thought and conceptualized for an insider, the citizen. How can democracy of the futures be built to actually include the so-called outsider, the immigrant, the refugee, the asylum seeker?
Okay, so I'll take you back a few years. So I think probably in the early 60s, going into the early 70s as well. And Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere had a vision for the African continent. So for Kwame Nkrumah, his vision was basically a United States of Africa. And he differed from Julius Nyerere in the sense that Julius Nyerere wanted a more, so for us to develop individually first and then come together, as opposed to just having a United States of Africa. So I say this loosely. But in terms of democracy and migration, what we are often seeing is that when we read the literature on migration, the predominant theme there, and based on interviews that people have, is that no one wants to leave their house to go to live in another country. In many cases, they are forced to do so. So we know about, push and pull factors that then cause people to migrate elsewhere. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we are having is that, to a certain extent, democracy has failed on the continent. And I think this is fueling a lot of the migration that we're seeing, whereby people are leaving their countries in search of better opportunities because democracy really hasn't played its role. You have democracy that has essentially been abused. It's seeing leaders staying in power for too long. That is causing the economy not to develop. In addition to that, citizens then don't have the life that they want to have. And as a result, they're then forced to go elsewhere. So I think that if countries are to resolve, the democratic, let's just call it the democracy question, that will then sort of address this idea of moving on, of people migrating. Because if democracy is working in country X, people don't have the need to leave because they have everything they need there. They have jobs, they're running water, they have electricity, they have everything that they need to live the life that they want to live. Yeah. And you can only have that within the context of a functioning democracy. So what tends to happen is if you look at how people are migrating, everyone is leaving what they think. Okay, look, they'll look at their country and they say, okay, look, I'm wasting my golden years, trying to make it, yet I can just go to another country and get better opportunities there. But if we then work on our democratic spaces to say, look, we need a more obviously inclusive system, this inclusive system will then extend to economies. And once that then happens, it's highly unlikely that people will leave a functioning economy because things are working there. And I think that is where I always say that democracy becomes important, because once you have a strong functional democratic system, your leaders are held accountable. They'll therefore act accordingly. They'll ensure that, opportunities are created. They'll ensure that, their citizens are not forced to seek healthcare elsewhere because everything in that particular country works. Yeah. So if you look at, I think it was Amartya Sen, is an economist. He's an economist by profession, and some of the works he looks at he has a book that is called Democracy as Freedom. And just loosely, if you've read that book, the argument he's making there is that if you have a functioning democracy, which is, effective change in government, independent institutions, it's likely that your country is going to function well because everything else will work because your government is playing its role, which is to create a better life for citizens.
Yeah. Phew. I think as one of, because I think also from migrations or migrants and all of that, another central theme that has become very popular in politics in the continent, even though it doesn't make it into election slogans, is the climate politics. And of course, I mean, the higher talks of it is on mitigation or adaptation, but it's something different when you're looking at it from grassroots. You know, when you're looking at it from the ground up, activists who actually thinking about the climate crisis, far from the mitigation and adaptation strategies that are usually imposed onto this. I'm wondering if you can talk to that, democracy and climate politics, and how we could actually kind of make sense of it from an African context.
So, one of the things that this is the discussions I have with some of the people I work with is the idea of governance and competing interests. So we're seeing a lot of this in terms of climate change. We see that there are a lot of competing interests. There's this idea of capital. I think in South Africa, one of the discussions is this, just transition and everything that comes with it. But at the heart of that, competing interests. And one of the things that, again, we're seeing with climate change is that it almost, to a certain extent, is a top-down approach. Yeah. So these decisions, people have, COPAC, they meet there, right? And then make decisions that then affect, the African continent or, affect African communities without actually consulting them, right? Yeah. So for me, my idea of democracy and how it relates to climate change is that I always have the belief that communities and citizens are aware of the things that they need. If we are going to go to our communities, we live there, we know what is needed, right? We don't need, policy from the first world to then come here and say, look, this is what we should be doing. So one of the things I would advocate for concerning democracy is maybe including this idea of indigenous knowledge. I remember, growing up in Zimbabwe, going to the rural areas, and my grandfather would have an idea of when to start planting his crops based on, a particular tree. You would look at a tree and say, oh no, it's blooming now. It's time for me to start. Because that would signify that the rains are about to come. There's knowledge on, on the fact that, okay, the first rain that comes is not really the rain we're waiting for. Yeah. This is just, an idea of introducing the rainy season. But the next, cycle is when we then start planting our crops. So that stuff has already been recorded. But what we're now seeing is the gaps and the times for those have now changed, and communities can tell you that. So what we then need to do is, if we include them, to say, oh no, in 1978 this was the cycle, but in 2008 it sort of started changing. That then gives you an idea of what is happening, right? But if you don't include the communities in this particular decision making process, this also applies to policy. So the Climate Change Act, the New Water Act in South Africa, all these things are very important elements that need to go back to to the people and sort of try to inquire from them, try to include them in the decision-making process. Because remember, at the end of the day, with democracy, we are trying to look at the inclusive nature of the system. And in order for us to address these challenges like climate change, even military coups to a certain extent, include the people, right? What are the challenges that you're facing? What role do you see your government playing? And do you feel included in that particular, process? And I think that inclusive nature of democracy should be the approach we should be using to addressing climate change, as well as some of the other challenges that we're facing. Yeah.
Speaking of competing interests, and I think this is a question I want to pose on you as a way out in terms of how could we rethink democracy from the continent, because we usually have to balance these competing interests. I mean, talking about water governance right now, that's huge shortage of water even here in South Africa, but you have a lot of water sitting in private hands. And I want to hear your ideas on building future democracies that, balance these competing interests be as inclusive as possible, and attend into really dismantling the colonial legacies in local government. What are your ideas on that?
So I think you just answered the question for me there when you talk about dismantling these colonial systems. So for me, I think one of the fundamental things we need to be looking at is this idea of decolonization. So when I say I'm not talking about trying to scare people, but I'm talking about just how we need to firstly acknowledge that, we inherited something that was based on marginalization. Even if we look at post-apartheid South Africa, we look at local government, right? When we look at areas like Soweto, Southern Western Townships, places like Soshangove, that there's a meaning behind all those places, right? Shangani, Tsonga, and so forth. So there's a meaning behind those things. What we need to be doing is trying to redress that, right? That is the only way we can then have an inclusive system, because we're trying to use something that was exclusive. We're using institutions that were serving the interests of a small minority, and somehow we think, using those same institutions, we can somehow make them inclusive. It's not going to work. The idea for us is to then not necessarily go back to the drawing board, but maybe try to revise how we are understanding this notion of democracy and trying to make it inclusive. And I think one of the fundamental ways of doing that is decentralization of power. Giving power to your communities to make their own decisions, allowing them the independence to address the challenges that they're facing, and then intervening when they need it. Because like I said, I believe that communities have the solutions to the challenges that they're facing. You need to engage them, right? Allow them, give them the independence to do so. And that's the only way we can then have an inclusive system. Because again, what we had was very exclusive, and it won't work in terms of what we needed to do. Hence these discussions we're having on democracy. We need to make that shift so that we find an African solution, as Thabo Mbeki would say.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining. Remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Thank you.